of which 3 were appointed by the previous Labour government.
Order. Order, and that does bring to a close questions for oral answer today. I call on Government Order of the Day number 1.
Mixed Ownership Model Bill, first reading.
The Honourable Tony Ryle.
Mr Speaker, I move that the Mixed Ownership Model Bill be now read a first time. I intend that the Finance and Expenditure Committee consider the bill, and I intend to move that the committee report to the House by the 16th of July 2012. Mr Speaker, this legislation and debate is about debt. It's not about the Treaty of Waitangi. It's not about foreign ownership. It's not about other consideration. It is about controlling our nation's debt. And this bill enables the government to remove 4 energy companies from the state-owned enterprises legislation and insert them into the Public Finance Act. And let's be clear on this. The new legislation we introduced today guarantees majority government control of these 4 energy companies. At least 51% remains in the government's hand. And it fixes into the law of this nation that no person and no entity, including foreign investors, can own more than 10% of the voting rights in any one of these companies. These companies will remain New Zealand-controlled companies contributing to the New Zealand economy, and that is what this legislation is about. The Mixed Ownership Model Bill is part of this government's wider economic program, which is about controlling debt, increasing savings, and getting our country through the worst financial crisis the world has seen in 100 years. Mr Speaker, no nation can afford to let their debt get out of control. But many countries are letting their debt get out of control, and in the process, very great chunks of their sovereignty are being taken away. These countries are losing control of their destinies. And you see it every night on the 6 o'clock news. Huge debt is at the core of why Britain, Spain, Italy and Greece are being forced to impose austerity measures, and the United States is locked in a debate about how to cut its enormous debt.
Point of order, the Honourable John Banks.
I sit about 9 feet to the right of the Minister.
Order. Member be seated. Can I just remind members that when there's a point of order on the floor, it is absolute silence. Call the Honourable John Banks.
And I've sat here at question time day after day, and all I hear is barracking and barking from all sides of the House. I'm one member of Parliament that's very interested in hearing what is being said and transacted across the House. Standing orders and Speaker's ruling has plenty to say, Mr Speaker, about rare and reasonable interjections. The barking and the barracking across this Parliament from side to side and corner to corner does this House no good. And people sitting at home watching on television and witnessing it in the galleries think it's a disgrace. And I put it to you, Mr Speaker, why don't we just give the Minister an opportunity to say what he's got to say? Then I'll listen very intently to what the members of the opposition have got to say, and we might learn something. How about that for a proposition?
Member has made his point. Interjections to be rare and reasonable, and I would refer members to Speaker's ruling 62/4. Call the Honourable Tony Ryle.
Mr Speaker, huge debt is at the core of so many of the problems of countries in Europe and around the rest of the world. Most of these countries have absolutely no choice whatsoever, but to put in place policies that reduce debt and that will greatly reduce important frontline services, while tens of thousands of people are protesting in the streets due to these measures. Britain is looking to reduce its public service by over 700,000 people in the next few years. Greece, Italy, Portugal, Spain are cutting their public health spending. Public servants from throughout Europe and other parts of the world are having their wages and salaries cut. Other countries are being forced to sell their public assets by their foreign bankers in order to get their debt under control. We do not want that for New Zealand. That party opposite might want to put this country on a road to Athens, but this party in government will not. New Zealand is different, and we are fortunate. Thanks to 3 strong years of leadership under this government, our financial management, New Zealand is not in that position. However, we have a duty to future generations to control our debt. Our debt is projected to increase to almost 30% of GDP, or $72 billion, in the next few years. But we've planned for and prepared for that. We will, in a few more years, will continue to borrow as we get our deficit under control, as we protect and grow our public services. But this government has confidence that our policies will carry us through and out of the recession as we get our books back into surplus, and that includes controlling our debt, and that is what this bill is part of. The partial public share offers we are providing for in this legislation, together with the sell-down of parts of Air New Zealand, is expected to raise between $5 and $7 billion. And we fully expect 85 to 90% of those companies will be New Zealand-owned when they float. And we can do that because the government controls the allocation policy for each of these share offerings. We will decide what categories of shareholders get what, and we will have New Zealanders at the front of the queue. Everyday people will get the opportunity to have a direct stake in these companies. Everyday people will have an opportunity to have a direct stake in these companies, and that's the heart of the opposition's attack. They don't believe that everyday New Zealanders can be trusted to own shares. They can't be trusted to own shares. Under this government, the $5 to $7 million worth of proceeds are going to be put in the Future Investment Fund, which is going to be available for important public infrastructure like schools and hospitals, instead of borrowing that money from overseas banks. The same banks who are putting the pressure on countries like Ireland, Italy and Portugal to pay back their loans and cut their services. As the Finance Minister has said, New Zealanders would rather pay dividends to New Zealanders than interest to overseas lenders. And the 4 energy companies will continue to be New Zealand controlled and New Zealand run, just like Air New Zealand. And we'll offer those shares predominantly to New Zealanders an opportunity to buy in these companies, raise funds to pay for much needed assets, schools and hospitals. And the government's made it clear we're not walking away from our treaty obligations. We held 10 consultation hui throughout the country, and we listened with an open mind. And as a result of the consultation, Section 9 is now being transmitted into the legislation with the clarification that private shareholders are not affected. Maori and all other New Zealanders will have their interests protected through the Resource Management Act, which these companies must comply with. They are still there. Now look, there's some who argue that the government is better off retaining full ownership because it gets more revenue from continuing to own these state-owned enterprises outright than the benefits of the partial sale. That is not right. The 4 energy SOEs' dividends have averaged about 4.1% over the last 5 years, compared to the cost of new debt for the same period of around 5.2%. So there's lots of other figures being thrown around, and let's be clear, the facts are that in general terms it's pretty evenly balanced. But what they don't take into account is the huge social benefit of the schools and the hospitals that the proceeds will be invested in. And the future profitability of these companies that private shareholders may get through their dividends, that future profitability is captured in the sales price. So we get the cash up front without risk. And that makes a lot of sense in these difficult times. And there are other important benefits flowing from this legislation. The opportunity for New Zealanders to invest and grow in their own economy. We've got Super Fund. The Super Fund is investing in energy companies throughout Australia, but they're not allowed to invest in our own country. not allowed to invest in our own country. Mr. Speaker, the government's thought long and hard before committing to this policy, because we know New Zealanders aren't enthusiastic about partial asset sales. They remember what happened in the late 80s under the Labour Party, and that's why we've got this new approach. But I say to New Zealanders, when you look at those polls, if we ask New Zealanders, do you want to prevent future generations being saddled with debt? I bet you they'd say yes. And that's what this government is determined to do. We must control the debt. And this mixed ownership model is about providing overwhelming New Zealand control and freeing up 3% of the government's assets that can go into a future investment fund to be invested in important schools and hospitals. This is important legislation. Our country must control its debt. This is part of a well-thought-through plan that will deliver benefits to New Zealanders for years to come. It will improve the investment opportunities for New Zealanders. It will help these companies improve, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, it will provide a very clear message to future generations that this was a parliament that recognised, at a time when the rest of the world was losing control of its destiny, this country took it back.
The question is that the motion be agreed to. I call the honourable member Grant Robertson.
Mr. Speaker, this bill is a desperate